everyone. We want to thank you, first of all, for joining us for this discussion with Steelcase's Rich Benoit, and I am Kyla Burns with LOTH. I'm the creative lead here. Rich, can you introduce yourself and your role with Steelcase?
Sure. Good morning. So I am a consultant with Steelcase's Applied Research and Consulting Group. So if you're not familiar, we're a global team that takes a lot of the research that Steelcase does through our Workspace Futures group and works directly with organizations around the world to help them better understand the research that we've done, also help them to apply that research into their workplace strategies and helping to create, more effective workplaces.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to thank One Columbus for having us this morning and its members that are joining us. And a special thank you to Ashley from Steelcase. She's helping us in the background today, and Kristen DeWitt, our marketing director here at LOTH. So what we are going to talk about today with Rich is really a dialogue around Steelcase's global research. That research is based on over 40,000 employees and their sentiments as it relates to return to the office. We'll have interactive discussions around and live polling, which we'll put that QR code up in just a minute. The return to work strategy, facts about hybrid work approach, and what hybrid does for culture. So Kristen, if you could move forward and show that QR code again. We're using the Slido app for participation in the polling. So they'll pop up throughout the discussion, some opportunities to vote or weigh in on where you are and your point of view, and we'll review those in our discussion today. If you want to go on to the next slide, Kristen. So really, when we look at return to office, I think it's been very clear that each one of us and each individual as a user and individuals as companies are in very different spots in their strategies. You might still be stagnant, not been in the office since last March. You might be starting to have those discussions and put a plan into place to maybe return in the next couple of months. You might have your plan in place, ready to go. You have a date set and when people will be returning. You maybe are returning right now, or maybe you've been back in the office for some time. So really, a lot of this discussion is understanding that there are a wide range of points in the process, and even down to the individual. If you are individually working from home long term, or you might be returning soon. This is kind of a scale for you to really think about where you are in the return. So our first poll is around this right now. Where are you in the return to work? Are you kind of in that stagnant phase? Are you starting to return to work? Do you have a plan in place? Are you returning now, or have you already returned? So we'll talk about those in just a minute, but Rich is going to get started on talking about what each of those categories are and what we're seeing and what this all means.
Sure. One of the kind of odd characteristics around this whole sort of predicament is, as much as Steelcase invests in research, this is one of those just-in-time learning opportunities. Everybody is at a different point. However, when we look, as we see the numbers coming up, there are a lot of organizations that have really returned to work. There are certainly a number of companies that stayed busy and people in the office during the pandemic because the nature of the work required them to be on site. So if you were in healthcare, or certainly some other customer facing industries where you have to be there. Obviously, people sort of figured out how to work through that safely, but the organizations right now are kind of all over the board because it's a fairly complex scenario, and we're all learning together. We get asked all the time, well, who made lots of changes and brought people back to the office, and how successful was it? Right now there, for people who have continued to work in the office, that's sort of one thing. And again, so as we look at the numbers coming up in place here, people, a third of you basically have already returned. And it'd be interesting, is that 100%, or is that at some sort of limited occupancy when you're within the office, where maybe you've got people coming in a couple days a week, you're not necessarily at full capacity. A number of you now have plans in place, which is great. And some of you, again, starting to return, and then some of you even getting to the point of in that process. And there's a lot of factors that companies are considering. One of the big things right now is the availability of daycare. It's great that schools were getting back in session, except that we're ending the school year. So looking for daycare for the summer, becomes one of those big issues. So we're hearing a lot of, especially big companies, waiting until September so that they can feel a little bit more assured that the numbers aren't going to go back up when people come in, kids are back in school, things will be a little bit more stable, the vaccination numbers will, continue to increase. So, right. But yeah, anything you want to add, Kyla?
No, I think that it's really interesting about the family dynamic. I know a lot have already returned and figured that out. Schools are in session right now, but I think that's an interesting perspective about when summer hits. My personal schedule actually gets better when summer hits because of that reason. I had a really good scenario work out, but I think that really goes back to the point that we have this broad range of circumstances that we're planning for when people do return. So really understanding what hybrid means to your team and planning for it when they get back into the office.
So the research that we did, Kyla mentioned, surveys and interviews with a number of activities, reaching out to about 40,000 global, knowledge workers. We've interviewed thousands of business leaders. We've been in, and this really is looking across not just North America, but in Europe and in Asia as well. The sentiment from lots of organizations is recognizing how much people value flexibility. So the opportunity to, not commute, and by the way, not spending time in the car commuting is the #1 global preference for why people like working at home.
Yeah.
However, there are people who also miss the differentiation between their home life and work life. So, for example, Microsoft has actually instituted commute time for their employees so that there is some sort of boundary between their home life and work life. Because, I mean, how many of you get out of bed, pick up your phone, and start answering emails before you've even gotten out of the bedroom?
Yeah.
And it's really easy to pick up the phone at 10 o'clock at night. You're watching TV. You're getting ready, and it's like, okay, you're still answering emails at 10 o'clock at night.
No boundaries right now.
Oh, you can relate.
Yeah, I'm just there's no boundaries when everything is happening within your home. It's really hard to differentiate and totally focus on that one thing.
Right. So companies have realized that the value in terms of work-life balance, that the value of flexibility, that giving people more choice and certainly control over their schedules are prompting them to consider, continuing some degree of flexible work arrangements. So when we think about, this hybrid approach, there are some companies who are thinking, people are going to continue working from home. It's been really successful for them. And hey, we're just going to eliminate a bunch of real estate and keep people at home permanently. And we're a little suspect about that because we saw companies do that about 10, 12 years ago during the recession when companies like IBM and Bank of America and Yahoo sent people home to work because it was a great cost savings for their real estate, only to eventually bring them back to the office. When we think about in the office, is it really about full time? But this hybrid is just think about it as giving people the flexibility to have a little bit more choice. And, you know, maybe people will decide to come into the office most of the time. Maybe they'll decide to come into the office maybe just a couple of days a week. But we're really curious, you know, what are your organizations planning right now? And so are they, you know, 100% in the office? Are they 100% working from home? Or is it some mix where people have some degree of flexibility, whether it's their choice or the organization dictates? So we'll let you kind of answer that, because as we see the complexity of organizations moving forward, when everyone was in the office, it was really easy to manage that. And certainly by default, people went to the office. And even though we would always talk about how technology would untether people from their desk, less than 15% of companies in the less than 15% of workers in the United States had any kind of flexibility to work away from their desk, or certainly work remotely. Right. So, you know, there was always an issue of, well, if I can't see them at their desk, how do I know they're working? Yep. And then all of a sudden, everybody went home to work.
Yep.
And everybody still worked.
Right.
You know, businesses didn't fall apart. Yep. Now, whether that is sustainable is really the big question. And so what companies are starting to kind of are challenged with is, do they, what does that cadence of presence look like? You know, how often should, people be in? So, with, the answers that we're starting to see in here, this is not surprising that the vast majority of companies are heading towards a hybrid approach. And recognizing that flexibility.
And you made a point recently about, people may be returning 4 to 5 days a week to the office, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Mm-hmm. And that flexibility, I think, is what you were touching on. How do we plan for or think about the fluidity of that and incorporating it into our teams moving forward?
Right. Especially from a organization and a cultural perspective, when everybody's in the office, companies knew how to manage that. When everybody went home, companies figured out, they have a remote workforce, but everybody was remote. So how do you now manage the workforce of the future, where some are in and some are out, but is it on a specific schedule? Is it left to the, to the whim of the individual? Is it about the team preference? So it's, again, it becomes really complex. And you can see your numbers. These are the numbers that came out of our study a few months ago. And your polling that shows that the hybrid went up is actually consistent. We're actually hearing that come up. And one of the dynamics that I think that is driving that, the companies that were planning to bring everybody back into the office are reading the stories around something like 40% of white collar workers are out job searching. So and there's a number of polls that a significant number of workers have stated that if their employer is going to make them come back to the office 5 days a week, they will quit and find another job.
That's so interesting.
So, companies that maybe weren't necessarily open to the idea are now being forced, just because it's becoming a talent retention issue.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, we've got, I have firsthand experience working with a couple of insurance companies with claim centers, and they're, planning on a, renovation to make it, a more interesting space, and thinking about this return to work. And now they are competing with other companies that are trying to poach their employees by offering them full-time work from home.
Wow. So let's dive into the hybrid. And I think that that's clearly where we're all headed. Our poll showed that, your global research is showing that. Can we dive into what that looks like for organization and things that we need to really think about when we are moving into that hybrid work mode?
Yeah, definitely, because this is the question that we're hearing from a lot of organizations is, well, how do we even approach this? And we see organizations that are having discussions at the leadership level, which is really good. We're hearing companies talk about, well, here's what the users want. Well, it's great to understand user sentiment, but there needs to be a balance. Autonomy. Autonomy without any kind of direction, you could have, all of a sudden, people decide, well, I'm just going to come in Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and then everybody comes in Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and you overfill your facilities, and then they're empty the rest of the week. So what we kind of identified are what we refer to as these three guiding factors. The organization, how do you maintain that sense of culture and keep nudging the culture in the right direction, as well as, what do you do with new employees? How do they learn the norms and the social etiquette and how work gets done here if they never really get to know people? What happens to those networks over time as they start to really disintegrate? What about those team dynamics in terms of how people get work done by themselves or together, and then individual preferences? So to dive in a little bit more on the next slide, when we talk about the needs of the organization, what does the business need in order to succeed? So there's always going to be roles that have to be done on site. So at Steelcase, the people that work in our test lab and model shops obviously have to do that in the office because of the equipment. So there's always going to be some roles that are technology dependent or equipment dependent that really do need to be there. And then you've got people who need to be there because they need to learn. They need to be mentored. This idea of how do we create a sense of purpose when we're all distributed? So leaders need to kind of have a point of view on what's sort of the minimum amount of time people should be away from the office. So people are thinking right now about, well, people are working from home, how do we bring them back in? We started flipping that. What about if we thought about how eligible are people to work away from the office? That we still know that there's tremendous value in coming together as teams and groups and communities to create a sense of belonging. That's really difficult to manage when everybody is completely distributed. It's a lot more work than people realize. And then also, how do you keep this sort of cultural equity across the organization so that people all still feel like, that they're part of something? Then on the next slide, when we talk about the team characteristics, we start to look at how people actually get their work done and the kind of work that they do. There are some roles that are more about being individual contributors, and if they're digitally enabled and it's a measurable task, certainly those are very successful working remotely. But then when we look at creative teams, whether it's like agile development, marketing teams, product development teams, where innovation is really driven by that interaction. Think about the meeting before the meeting and the meetings that happen after the meetings and the side-by-side conversations and bumping into people in the hallway or walking by and seeing what another team is doing. We're missing all of that. So companies that really thrive on innovation and creativity are really feeling that kind of falling up, not being as strong as it was, because everything right now has to be formally scheduled. You can't just like, hey, Kyla, I got a question. I got to ping her and see if she's available. And she might be, she may be there, she may not be. And then the third factor, when we think about the individual, is really understanding user sentiment. There's some companies are thinking, well, everybody loves working from home, we're just going to keep them there, only to find out that they're younger in their career and they got 14 roommates in a 3-bedroom apartment, and they're all sharing the kitchen table and the bandwidth.
Right.
or your kids have been home the whole time. So, 3 of them are being homeschooled and you're working with 4 different school schedules because they're hybrid and your partner is always there and grandma broke her hip and had to move in because she needs. And so the only time you actually have to work is at, between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. when everybody else is in bed. So the idea that we all have the same experience working from home is really not true. So getting a better understanding about what people do like about working from home and what their challenges are can really start to help inform a return to work strategy. Who are those people that really want to come back to the office? Who are those people who really need to come back to the office? How are those team dynamics going to now really be reinforced by the value of co-location in order to really start to drive performance in the organization?
Yeah, and I also think going back to the individual, you were talking about maybe the worker that's at home with 14 roommates. I feel like there's a big gap in transfer of knowledge from seasoned veterans and the newer workforce in really that organic training sense where we're missing out on that absorption of knowledge and just observation, which, like you had mentioned, we have to schedule that now.
Yeah, especially when we look at even the transition companies are going through over the last 2 years with baby boomers retiring.
Right.
You have all those people with that tribal knowledge that how do you pass that along? And I guess in one example, from working with an engineering company where they had started on a journey of a mobile of supporting mobile working, and this is before the pandemic, but there's some interesting learnings. So when they ended up leveraging a number of tenured senior engineers because they were more proficient at their job. So they started working from home and they got really comfortable, after they went through their transition. So they had a significant part of their population who really felt that they were quite capable of working from home by themselves and never wanted to come back into the office. So they knew their job, they had their established networks, they had their positions and within the organization. So their feeling was, I can do my job from home. It's all the new engineers that really need to be in the office. It's like, okay, but who are the new engineers going to learn from if you're not there?
Right.
So part of this shift, when we think about what this individual preference is like, no, you don't need to come to the office necessarily just to do your job, but you need to come to the office to be more of a mentor. So it changes again that dynamic about inclusion and how organizations can think about leveraging all of that tacit knowledge that people have. That we think about explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge, like Kyla is referring to. It's easy to ask a question and get an answer. It's a very different thing to be, how do you push and become more curious if every conversation becomes transactional?
Right.
I can give Kyla the answer, to the question and give her the information she needs, but that's where it ends. And so, for where we start to see the biggest drivers for innovation is creating a culture of curiosity. And right now, having all of these virtual interchanges doesn't really do a lot for inspiring people to ask more questions than they have to, because when you log into a Zoom call or a Teams call, all you're worried about is like, how long is this going to take?
Right, exactly. Because you have the next one coming up.
Yes, exactly. And so everything has these, these hard boundaries. And it's like everything now is scheduled.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, everybody out here, you have more meetings than you ever did before because it's the only way to communicate.
Right. Yeah. So I love when you talk about drivers and enablers, which I think is a great next step from the discussion we just had.
So we use this, or refer to as this work experience framework in almost nearly all of our discussions with, with organizations to help them sort of identify how they might approach and this comes out of the work we do around design thinking. Frameworks in general become an incredibly useful tool to manage information, because if you think about, you've done a survey with your employees to understand user sentiment, and maybe you did some focus groups to dive in, and maybe there were conversations or discussions with leaders. Maybe like HR has worked through and they have a point of view, and you've got lots of information. Like, how do you turn that so it's not just noise? Hey, we got all this stuff. So we use frameworks.
We talk about that a lot, where right now people are surveying and asking more than ever, and trying to truly understand what people need, what they have, what they're lacking, and what they might need. And so this is awesome. I think everyone's okay. Everyone is confused. Okay, I have all of this great info. Now what do I do?
Yeah. And so the use of frameworks, again, as mentioned, it's a design thinking strategy to help put information and contextualize it so that you can take the data and turn it into information that becomes useful in making decisions. And so this framework allows us to start with the organizational ambitions. So what is the business trying to accomplish? How does the business, what are the characteristics that are going to drive performance? And it might be things like, we need to be more collaborative to drive creativity. We need to make sure we have we can retain and engage our talent in a way that they want to provide that discretionary effort to make us successful. We need people to really believe in our purpose and our mission, because those are the things that are going to really foster the kinds of work activities that are going to really influence our business performance. Mm-hmm. Because if you're making investments into the business, they're to support accelerate the growth of the business. So we want to make sure that those business drivers are very clear. What does it take for your business to be successful? And then we break that down. We start to look at culture, and we talk about the people and the behaviors. What do they do when they're at work, and how do they interact with each other? So the culture, those behaviors of people at work, and the processes. How do people actually get their work done? And digital transformation had started a number of years ago, and I think everybody can attest to they are far more technologically proficient than they were a year ago. I know I am, even though, like my wife will laugh at my use of my iPhone. But digital transformation has accelerated in ways that people were expecting it was going to take 3 or 4 years to be able. So even think about turning on a video camera. I know a year ago the resistance to video calls was enormous. Yeah. And now it's just sort of second nature.
Yeah.
And when you say upload a file to the to the SharePoint so other people can access, and people go, yeah, I know what that is.
Yeah. You're speaking my language now.
So what we encourage organizations to do is to take to understand how work is changing because of digital transformation. I mean, think about all those companies that, and I can say I have done work with a number of companies that could not understand how they could ever work without paper and all the files, and they have stack of folders, and they've got binders, with all their operating manuals, and all of a sudden they went home to work and they had to leave all that stuff in the office, and they figured it out.
Yeah.
So I think this is probably, aside from the fact that everybody's learned to work differently, this has now created the biggest shift away from a paper-based society than we could have ever done, because people all had to figure it out. So when you think about all these new ways of working, and then companies thinking about how do we want people to interact with each other? How do we really help them immerse themselves in our mission and this sense of purpose? because that's really a big part of what drives engagement, is that sense of purpose, is that feeling of belonging. It's aligning with the organization's mission. And so the more organizations start to identify those behaviors they want to continue, and behaviors they want to maybe nudge a little bit. And so one of the things that we've been playing around with is this idea of rituals. What are the things you used to do in the office that really drove specific behaviors? Like, okay, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you went out and grabbed, you went to get coffee, and you did your little sort of circuit through the office because you bumped into people that you knew were there to just catch up. Yeah. Or, my favorite one from, before was the group of people that smoked on the corner. So, smoking was one of those things that like aligned a number of disparate people in things that are not necessarily purely business related. And those are the things that really start to build and enhance your networks. Mm-hmm. And we look at all of this as the real drivers to business performance. So as organizations think about a hybrid approach to working, thinking about how has digital transformation changed the way people are getting their work done, because it is going to be more digital regardless of where you started. And then what are the behaviors that really support the way the organization wants to, really wants to get their work done? And clarity around those drivers can start to reinforce how the organization creates value, so that then when we start to look at tools in space, they are simply enablers. They're either it's kind of like a pass fail, or it's, think about a lever, and it's either going to help the organization move forward or it's going to hold them back. And so, companies will always think about, well, let's start with the space, and the space will start to change behavior. Well, we know that there is absolutely a link to encouraging specific behaviors through the space. But if you haven't identified the behaviors first, you may be reinforcing behaviors you don't want. Mm-hmm. So when companies are thinking about enticing people to come back to work because, hey, I've been working from home, this is great, the excuse of, well, you need to be in the office to do your work doesn't really hold any water anymore. Mm-hmm. Everybody's doing work at home. That's not a good reason to come to the office. A good reason to come to the office is because you want to have these face-to-face interactions. You want to embrace the culture. You might want to be able to have access to some additional tools that you may not have at home. In some cases, you may want to go to the office because it's quiet and you can focus, and you can actually connect and think about the rhythms of the day where you're, working with somebody else, you're doing something by yourself, you're going into, potentially a team meeting, and how the rhythm of the day can actually be supported by having the right kind of place. And so the more the organization understands around how work should be getting done, especially now that everybody has had this experiment. When everybody came to the office by default, you just sort of like did it, and nobody really was very thoughtful about what was going on in the office. Well, now with people working from home, everybody's had an opportunity to experiment. Can I sit on my living room sofa and actually work comfortably, or do I get a backache? Do I have a home office where I can shut the door, or do I need to wait to some time of the day where other people aren't in the house, so I do have that privacy? So the awareness that people have now about the way they work is significantly higher than when they were in the office, where they just kind of went through their day without really thinking about it. So people are going to be far more intentional in when they think about planning their day. And so when companies are sort of thinking about addressing this hybrid approach, how do you create the best experience for people, whether they're in the office or they're working from home, and so that there's equity of around where am I working? So it's not about the have and have nots. So that, okay, well, I'm in the office, so should you, because that not necessarily, no one other people may have a different perspective around what their appropriate balance might be.
Right. So we're gonna post our next poll, and it's really around if your workplace is designed to enable your organization of hybrid workers. And while everyone is answering that, Rich, we have a few, that takes us into our Q&A session, which I have some great follow-up questions showing up in the Q&A section.
Oh, terrific.
Yeah, so someone asked, we haven't talked about productivity. Are people more productive at home or in this office or in the office?
That is such a loaded question.
Do your best.
So, no, it's an absolutely, it's a critical question. So for companies that were kind of touting, employees are more productive working from home. It depends on what you're measuring. So if you are measuring repetitive, clearly sort of identifiable tasks, productivity has gone up. So the insurance company and the claim center I mentioned, employees self-reported that they were more productive, and a lot of these employees were call center employees. So the measurable output was very simple. I mean, they knew how many calls and the quality, and right. So managers actually were able to identify that productivity had gone up. What we learned about why was actually really more interesting. The lack of distractions or interruptions from working from home for repetitive heads down work, you can be more productive, but also people were working more hours. Yeah. So if they maybe needed to leave work early because the kids had a soccer game or they've got a doctor's appointment, the company kind of lost a couple of hours a week from an employee, and it's just part of the nature of being an employer. When they were working from home, they were far more likely to go back and finish their day. So they were actually getting more work hours out of employees. So yes, most companies will say productivity is up, but it's also because people are working more hours. They're spending their commute time doing work versus, versus commuting. What is not as obvious is business performance. So individual productivity that can be tracked because of task-oriented work for people, that are able to focus at home and don't have those distractions. That level of productivity has increased. But if you're an organization that thrives on more innovation and creative endeavors, those are taking longer. And but again, it's looking at the overall performance and usually of a team. So one of the things we had definitely seen this transition over the last several years is less about individual productivity and more around team performance. Yeah. So as work becomes more complex and more interrelated, it's like, the whole thing about it takes a village becomes more prominent with creative work. And so that's where companies are starting to see the downside of remote work, because the decision making is taking longer, access to information may be a little bit slower, and then people are also taking fewer risks. And risk taking is an important characteristic of driving innovation. So when you were all in the office working on something together, you all felt like you had each other's back. So, okay, if I push an idea forward, I've got people there to kind of give me some feedback about it and sort of support the risk taking. Well, if you're working alone by yourself and you have that sense of isolation, you don't necessarily have the camaraderie that would encourage you to take the same kind of chances that you would do when you have that trusted network that's there to support you.
I just wrote down I love the point of productivity versus performance. I think those are two very different statistics. And when that productivity conversation comes up in your leadership meetings or within your organization, I think that's a great point, Rich, that, that safety and trust to make decisions and be have a higher performance is really lacking.
Yeah, and that takes more time. You can't do that. You can't, that's not like a weekly status report.
Measure, right. Yeah, so we had another question here. The stat that you shared, 40% of people are seeking new jobs. What are tips to engage employees during this time to prevent turnover?
There's some really interesting articles that primarily from Gallup, the Gallup organization, around how successful managers have made it through the pandemic to maintain engagement. And one of the things that we've seen across the board is greater transparency between the organization and employees. So it was, you think about how many CEOs live streamed from their home offices just to give employees a sense of, what they were going through. And so that kind of sort of intimate connection has gone a long way. So what we were starting to see is that engagement numbers were actually higher than normal during the pandemic for those, particularly for those companies that were communicating. And in fact, there's a really interesting McKinsey study that shows that any communication is better than not communicating. That, what people just want to know what the organization is thinking. And it isn't necessarily you have to have the answers, but it's that at least this awareness of what is the organization considering. And the companies where there was a continued stream of information, and it was just simply updates. And a lot of those updates were, we don't know, we still don't have an answer. But providing that conversation was really very meaningful to keep people feeling they were connected to the organization. So managers that have been successful with this have learned to reach out to their employees, and in some cases, they were reaching out more frequently because than they would have in the office. Because in the office, they would tend to just, again, it's this paradigm. Well, Joe's sitting at his desk, he's doing fine. If he's got an issue, he'll call me. So I may not interact with all my employees, especially if I have a large team. I may not have a consistent series of interactions. It's sort of as needed. When people went home, they were much more intentional about scheduling, a 15-minute check-in every week, just to see how things were going. And those touch points have been very, very meaningful. And there's actually an expectation of coming back, even with this hybrid approach to working, that employees value that personal interaction with their leaders, and sort of are hoping it's not going to go away, because as much as it's been formalized, it's been incredibly helpful. Just that check-in. So that's going to be, some of those things around helping people, again, feel that sense of engagement. We also know that, from culture research, this sense of belonging, this connection to the mission, the purpose of the organization are incredibly powerful factors with engagement. And so the more visible and transparent and communicated the mission is, obviously those are huge factors. So and this is, part of the case of when people are working remotely and all their information is digital, you kind of miss, again, that sort of those nuances or that tacit understanding of what are my coworkers doing? And I'm here to support my coworkers because we're all here connected to support the mission. And if I don't, I guess to say one way, if I don't feel the love, then I may not necessarily stay as interested. And then I start to look at, well, there's other opportunities.
That, I think, could lead into this next question, some things that you just mentioned, connection and engagement. You're missing nuances when you're just in this digital world, the nuances of your coworkers, what everyone else is up to, and supporting the mission. The question was, if people can work from home or anywhere, why would they come into the office? Which I think you were answering there at the end of that explanation.
So yeah, what our survey data would say is that they miss the face-to-face interaction, they miss the socialization, they while they're able, and it gets back to that question of productivity. If your mindset is very task-centric, I just need to get my work done, then a lot of those workers feel like they can just stay at home because I'm doing my work. Well, how do you create an organization that's doing our work? And again, that is that keeping that connection to the organization, that sense of purpose. People kind of, that's what's really starting to lag with people working from home. And so that when we poll workers in every organization, they do miss that face-to-face interaction. That doesn't mean they want it 40 hours a week.
Right.
But they, so it's like, it's not an all or nothing situation.
Right.
It's like, yeah, they do like the autonomy and the freedom and the flexibility of working from home, but they also miss the camaraderie and the socialization and just the interaction. So it's finding the right balance. And some people want a lot more of that. So they're going to be more likely to come into the office more often. There are certainly, we look at these personas of what would drive people into the office. And there are people who just love want the social energy. These are people who would go and sit in Starbucks and work, and not because they knew anybody there, but just because they love the whole thing, the buzz. So
Right.
you have people that want to come back to the office, not because they want to connect with any one person, but they just want to connect to the organization.
Right.
And then you're going to have people that want to come because they love the discipline of being in the office and having that separation between their work life and home life. I don't want to, especially, and that's very generational. I mean, baby boomers stayed at work till the end, late into the night because they didn't want to take work home. So they would stay late. You've got a younger generation that just thinks about working whenever. And a big part of that is, that the work is, has been digitized so they can do that. But, one generation might think, I want to spend more time in the office because that's where I feel productive. Another generation might feel like, I can do my work anywhere. So I really do value that flexibility.
Yeah, and we had another question. What does hybrid model look like in an organizational level, and how many days a week do people come in? And I think you just made a point that it can be different for everyone based on your productivity and performance, and what if you are if your job is qualified to be in office or at home.
Yeah, and this is, I think some companies are struggling because they want to create an equitable distribution, and deciding like, well, everybody can work from home 1 or 2 days a week. Okay, well, that's relatively simple. But is it everybody at home the same 1 or 2 days a week?
Right.
And then you end up, what a lot of companies are thinking is, okay, if we give people more flexibility, so not everyone is at the office at the same time, we can scale repurpose our real estate to be more meaningful and more intentional. So that if people are coming in to collaborate, we need more collaboration spaces. If we have people that are coming in to network, then maybe we need more social spaces. But and this is why, doing things like surveys to understand their user sentiment around why do your employees want to come in, and start to kind of create, it's almost like when we talk about these personas, how many people want to come into the office every day so that you can accommodate versus, how many people never want to come back in or come in rarely, so that you can do a better job with allocating real estate to spaces that are going to be more meaningful to people coming back into the office. So I know with that last poll question, we had, I believe it was, something like 50%
to 41
of the, responses were, feeling like the office, is going to work well for hybrid. And a lot of offices will. It may be a matter of sort of repurposing what some of those spaces are. So the space, the settings and the spaces themselves may be perfectly acceptable the way people use them. For example, workstations may become unassigned and be used by multiple people. That doesn't mean the workstation has to change. It just means the sense of ownership changes.
Right.
So there's, a number of ways to accommodate, hybrid work. But the more you sort of understand the makeup of the organization so that you can accommodate employee needs, where some may want to work from home, and the role that they have make them more eligible to work from home, as opposed to, there are some roles that just aren't eligible to work from home, and it's the nature of the role. And, as a employer, I mean, people will sort of figure that out, that, it's just because, there are some companies, well, because certain roles have to be done in the office, we're not going to give anybody flexibility, because if we can't give it to everyone, we're not giving it to anyone. And, now it's a matter of like, well, somebody chose that role. That's what required of that role versus, they could choose a different role that may, give them some additional flexibility.
So the last question we'll touch on is, I think, a good segue in what you were just saying. How do we know if our office is designed to enable hybrid organization? Do we need to make changes? But I think you just touched on that, Rich. Some of your current applications might work fine for a hybrid organization, but there might be some adjustments that need to be made to make your spaces more intentional for that work that will be happening in the office.
And there's ways to assess what you have, but if we go back to that work experience model, that framework, what is it that what does the end result need to look like so you can understand where the space isn't meeting the needs? And it may be even technology. So I guess one of the best examples is, how many of you have those big honking speaker phones in the middle of a conference table in a meeting room, and there's no monitor on, there's no monitor, there's just a speaker phone. Today, everybody is connecting virtually through technology on their laptop, and everybody can see each other and everybody can talk to each other. You can share content. If I come back to the office and I need to have a meeting and some of my team members are working from home, or they're in another location, whatever it might be, and I pick up and all I have is that conference phone, I'm going to stay home because I can have a better experience doing this with my personal device than coming with a group device. So, that's just a really good example of upgrading spaces that you have with technology.
Yep, and repurposing and evaluating what's there as it relates to the behaviors that will be happening to support your hybrid organization.
Right.
Awesome. Do you have any, I think we're done with questions, any closing remarks, Rich, that you want to make sure people are remembering or thinking about as we approach this hybrid model?
If there's ways, that to look at, collecting the data, helping, and I think this is a good segue that, there, an organization like LOTH that, and with Steelcase sort of backing them up, having the tools to be able to help explore what things, what kind of journey that might be appropriate. So for some organizations, it may be a lot of change. In others, it could be just, things that are layered on, and things about repurposing and helping people learn new behaviors that start to address, new ways of working.
Awesome. So we always say at LOTH, we'll meet you where you are and take you where you want to go. I think that is a really good tagline for this conversation, is everyone might be in a different spot, but really understanding where you want to go and planning for that. I just want to say thank you to everyone that attended today. Rich, specifically, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Always a pleasure. We appreciate your time today. And I want to thank Chip Holcomb with One Columbus, Rich again, and Ashley from Steelcase, and the LOTH team, Kristen DeWitt, for all their work behind the scenes, and everyone that attended today. Please let us know if you have further questions. There's information up on the screen right now of people you can contact, and we'd be happy to speak to you. But again, thank you for your time. I hope everyone has a wonderful day and rest of your week.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.